met in person, but we've actually been getting a lot more participation online, which is kind of surprising and exciting. So thanks for joining us. And I'm always available if you have questions. I'll throw our website and contact info in the chat momentarily. So thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, Carl's a wealth of knowledge, especially anything around Rutland Solid Waste District. The other solid waste district which operates in our county of Rutland County here is the Solid Waste Alliance Communities, and Pamela Clapp is also here. Pam, can you hear me? I know you're calling in. Did you just want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I'm Pam Clapp. I'm the administrator for the Solid Waste Alliance Communities, and between the Solid Waste Alliance Communities and Rutland Solid Waste District, we have membership of all of the towns in Rutland County. The towns that SWAC represents are Benson, Chittenden, Fairhaven, Middletown Springs, Rutland Town, Paulette, Shrewsbury, Sudbury, Timoth, and West Haven. So if you live in those towns and you have questions, I'll also put my contact information there. Don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you might have.
Great, thanks, Pam. Yeah, so between Carl and Pam, hopefully we can answer anything about transfer stations or on the regulatory aspect of things. They're both avid composters themselves. And I know Linda is going to be answering a lot of our compost questions tonight. Linda's a master composter. Linda, did you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Sure, I'm Linda Pipkin. I am a master composter, also a master gardener. I've been composting about 30 years in various towns in the state. Currently, I'm doing it in Middlebury. Been doing that at close to, wow. Maybe I have been doing this more than 30 years, but any event, doing that there for quite a few years. And then in the summer, I'm at Lake Dunmore, and I have another system going here. And I do worms at home, and I'm about to purchase a green cone to share with our neighbors. So I think I can at least attempt to answer questions in a lot of areas. And I'm thrilled to see you all here because I love compost.
Yeah, so there's 66 folks on this call actually, and it's growing as people trickle in. Hopefully I can admit people once our PowerPoint presentation starts going. So for folks who are just joining us, we just introduced ourselves. There are a lot of other people on our team too who are also in this chat, and we may call on them, also master composters of different levels and skills. So we will be doing just a brief PowerPoint on how and why we compost. And then we'll dig into hopefully really the meat of this presentation hopefully will be folks' questions about everything that comes up when they compost, problems, troubleshooting, how to design a system that works for you. So without further ado, feel free to use the chat at any point through the presentation, or, you know, if I get bored and you need to go get another beer from the fridge, don't be ashamed, just mute me, go to the fridge, get a beer, maybe it'll sound a little more interesting afterwards. So without further ado, I'm gonna try to share my screen and hopefully this works. And hopefully most of the folks who are joining us are already on. Can we see that? Is head nod, thumbs up, mostly thumbs up? Cool. So this is a presentation. We kind of went through it. Can I go full screen on that? We might just have this little bit on the side. I don't know if you can see it. I can see it. So we're going to talk about why we care about food waste, or as Carl has taught me to think about it, our wasted food, and what we can do about it in our own backyards. Right now, whoops. If I put my apple core in my trash can and it went to my transfer station, which is in Chittenden, run by SWAC, where does it end up? Carl, where would it go?
Goes, well, from Rutland, it's 140 miles to Coventry, Vermont, way up in the Northeast Kingdom. And it's the only active lined landfill in Vermont currently. And they just got a big extension for about 20 years of capacity if we stay at our same generation rates.
Yeah, and generation rates are going up. I think I was looking at a statistic the other day, just COVID alone, that household waste has gone up 20 to 30%. So that's a little mind-boggling. Yeah, most of Vermont's trash goes to Coventry. If I brought my food waste to a transfer station, where would that food waste go?
If you dispose in the food scrap drop-off, it'll often go to a compost facility, an industrial facility, which they will take meat and dairy with, and bones and anything that was alive at one point, basically. And at least in Rutland County, a majority of it goes to the Shaftesbury transfer station near Bennington. And that's about 40 miles, so still kind of a ways, but a lot closer than the landfill. And then the soil is actually used for various things, which is great.
Cool. Yeah, and Casella just bought out that facility. I think that.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And then there are some additional places two of the SWAC transfer stations send their wasted food to a chicken farmer. And one of the towns actually sends it to an actual farmer for incorporation into his compost pile.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. And so we'll talk a little bit about if you want to feed your animals or your neighbor's animals with food scraps. There are a couple more facilities across the state. There's 4 or 5 major commercial composting facilities I know of. And there are some digesters as well. But feeding food to animals, number B on the slide we're all looking at, is a great way of getting the most out of your wasted food. For the most part, this evening we'll be talking about F. That's why there's multiple arrows pointing at F, because we're going to talk about home composting, because it's something you can do right in your own backyard, and it's really something that you can do to really reduce your own footprint, and make a lot of great fertilizer too. This is just a breakdown of what kind of waste in Vermont looks like. About 24% of it is organics. Maybe 20% of that, we think 1/5 of that could be diverted away from the landfill or Coventry, right? The problem with food waste in landfills, well, there's a lot of problems with food waste in landfills, and we'll kind of briefly touch upon it, and we can dig more into it in questions if people have more questions, is that what happens when you put organic matter in landfill, there's an anaerobic breakdown. The bacteria that lives without oxygen breaks down organic material, and it produces gases. It produces carbon dioxide and methane and carbon dioxide are greenhouse gases, and those are what are contributing to kind of warming up the world by several degrees and creating kind of climate crisis everywhere. This is just some graph that shows the amount of total crop acreage of wasted food in the world. It's huge. And so if you think about all the resources, the labor, the fertilizer, the water that goes into that sort of acreage is immense, right? 21% of all fresh water. So these are all things, like I said before, that we can individually do as a household to reduce our footprint. It's reducing our own food waste through composting and other means, either source reduction, right? Buying less, meal prepping, maybe, thinking ahead of time about how I'm going to eat the food in my fridge before I buy it all at Hannaford's. All of those things help us reduce the amount of food that may go into a landfill and turn into carbon dioxide or methane. Methane is about 22 to 86 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And food waste is the number 3 producer of methane in the world. A lot of these landfills have ways of capturing these biogases, and they try to turn it into energy. There's been some greenwashing recently with Vermont Gas and their renewable gas program. If you're interested in issues like that, I do encourage you to show up at a local 350 meeting. We're having one this next Sunday where we talk about intersectionality of energy and the environment. And we're going to talk a lot about the intersections of race in the environment on Sunday. Like a shameless plug. But today we're talking about composting, and why we care about it too is because it's going to be a law. Come July 1st, you will be mandated to divert your waste from your food waste from your trash. That means you can bring it to your transfer station. How do I do that, Carl? If I just wanted to bring my food scraps to the transfer station, what's the best way of doing that?
You get any old bucket that works for you or bag, and just bring it there with your regular trip and drop it right in every transfer station has a tote, so a kind of bin on wheels instead of putting it in the trash compactor or dumpster. And it's, just dump out the bag. You can rinse it, bag or bin, and rinse it, reuse it. You can even freeze it if you were worried about smell. But we'll get into more ideas later, more options like that.
Does it cost money?
In some places, not every place. So it depends. Just check with your town.
Cool. So we care about it because it's a law and we all want to do the right thing, right? This isn't being punitively enforced. Nobody's going to tear open your trash bags and say, oh, Bob threw in an apple core. There goes Bob again, breaking the law. No, we're just going to the state is trying to gently push people in the right direction. And this will save Vermonters a lot of money in terms of taxpayer dollars at the end of the day. Another reason to care about it. With that brief bit about why we compost, let's watch a brief video that Carl did on the basics of how to compost, and then Carl's going to take us home with the rest of the short PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll dig into some questions. So hopefully, if folks' internet is working, this should come through well. If your internet is slow, this may not come through well, in which case, just mute your computer. It is short, and it'll be over soon.
Hi, I'm Compost Carl from the Rutland County Solid Waste District. There's nothing I like more than seeing food scraps being put to good use. The Universal Recycling Law says that no one in Vermont may throw food scraps in the trash starting on July 1st, 2020. I'm going to show you some options on how to avoid that. Come on, let's go. We're at Rebecca's house here in Rutland, and they're going to show us how they compost.
All right, so here's our little kitchen composter, and here's our little unit here that we got at the County Solid Waste District down there by the water treatment plant. And super easy, collect the scraps, put them in there. Eventually they go down, you can take them out of the drawer, and if it start getting like too wet or too smelly, we just put in dried leaves, and it's super easy, and it gives us a lot of compost for our garden, and saves money on garbage, and it helps the planet.
That's great. Well, thanks for showing us. Hey, so we're at Alma's house in Pulteney here, and they've got chickens, and they'll even eat your food scraps for free. So how do you take care of chickens?
You feed them and water them.
Easy enough, right? And then they'll feed you. They laid this egg sandwich this morning. Well, hey, Nick, I hear you have pet worms, huh?
I do have pet worms. Would you like to see them?
Yeah, let's check them out.
So the worms are really easy to take care of. It doesn't require a whole lot of maintenance. They feed them once a week. You know, if done correctly, you should have no odor.
Awesome.
It smells like really nice soil.
Yeah.
Are these
these options cheap and easy enough for you? If not, you can always drop food scraps off at any transfer station in Vermont, just like Patty here.
That was easy.
Nice. For more information on how to divert food scraps from the landfill, visit www.rcswd.com or call 802-775-7209 during business hours. See you next time.
Hopefully everybody got as much of a kick out of that as I do every time I show it. Without further ado, Carl's going to give us some basics on backyard composting. And then we're going to get out of the PowerPoint and we're going to have a lot of cool, fun questions that our master composters can answer. There already have been some questions going down in the chat. Linda and Abigail, who is on our team and also a master composter, have been addressing those. But if you have a question that's going to load out one end and through another, be sure to leave it in the chat and we will circle back to it. And with that, I will zip it. And Carl, it's on you.
Thanks, Jacob. I meant to say this in my introduction, but we had 146 people register for this workshop, which is awesome. And out of them, 86 are already diverting food scraps to a certain degree, which is great. So good job, y'all. And I'm sure you all have a lot of experience and knowledge. Hopefully you get something out of this. And 57 of them are home composting. So that's really awesome. And yeah, let's dig in, as Jacob says. So this is the process, the steps that we've come up with as a team. You know, some people will say it's easy as 1, 2, 3. I say it's easy as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's really not a big difference. So you can do it. We're with you. If you get confused, we're here for you with questions. So step 1, selecting the process and what do you want to get out of it? Step 2, choosing a location with convenience in mind if it's going to get snowy because we're in Vermont. Step 3, collecting materials. You can never have too many browns. I'm going to say that many times during this presentation. Step 4, building the pile, making sure to alternate greens and browns at least 3 times the number of browns that you add your greens or your food scraps, and we'll break into what those are later. And then you let it decompose. We had a lot of questions, or a few questions about it not breaking down. If you have followed the first 4 steps pretty well, then things will definitely break down. You just got to give it plenty of time. If it hasn't broken down after 2 years, you probably want to add some moisture, add some browns, something like that. And then finally you get to put it in your garden or give it away if you don't have a use for it. So next slide, please. Yeah, basically where you want to put it, ideally on top of or on the ground, in contact with the ground, is best to provide the surface area for microbes, worms, and other things that help the breaking down of the food scraps and compost is really important. So if you have yard space, that's great. If you don't, then maybe you can compost in your kitchen with worm composting like Jacob and Linda and many others do. Or you can sometimes use a tumbler in your garage, even in the winter. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. The winter is the main concern. Just, are you willing to dig out your path to go as far as you want to be away from the house? Or are you going to put it closer in the house and make it more rodent proof? So you could have just a open pile that is legal per se, but you want to make sure it's not causing a nuisance to your neighbors or to anyone else in your town or to your own self. So the pit and trench can also work if you want to dig down a little. But yeah, I like the bin systems. So yeah, you can go forward again. Pallets are plentiful. So definitely look for those and save a few. If you just stand 3 up, you've got a compost bin right there, and it'll help build the pile up so that it aerates well and has kind of a structure. And if you want to put a roof on it, you can, but again, you're going to need to watch the moisture content. And if you want to build your own system, there are so many resources online that you can look up DIY, do-it-yourself compost systems, and you will get every person that has ever put a YouTube video up with their compost bin system. So have at it. And next slide, please.
Where do folks get pallets in Rutland County? If anybody has good places to get pallets, leave it in the chat. I know at Agway at Garland's, you can get pallets for pretty cheap or free if they're kind of half broken.
If you're really nice to the transfer station folks, they will probably let you take a pallet or 2 or 3 or however many you need.
And you should always be nice to your transfer station.
Indeed, especially now.
Other places would be Home Depot, LaValle's Tractor Supply. They're usually pretty good about giving pallets away.
Yeah. So the tumbler is cool. It's again, you can either purchase or build your own, and that one pictured is insulated, so it does allow it to continue composting in cold weather, and maybe not below freezing, unless you're in a garage even, which might not get too low. But you still want to add food scraps in and then actually dump the contents out after you've mixed them up and let them sit for a while, maybe a few weeks once it's full, or dump it out right away, and it just needs to finish composting in contact with the ground so that it actually cures properly and has all the microbes that you want. So you can go to the next slide. Here are the bins, some bins available for purchase. You can get some hardware cloth or wire, chicken wire even, and just stand it up. And some people will plant tomatoes or something that likes to grow right up the cage too, right next to it, which is a good use of space in your, if you have a limited space in your garden. Currently, these bins are very fluctuating in their availability because everyone is really excited about composting, which is awesome. We ran out of green cones. You can normally get both the Soil Saver and green cone at our office in Rutland, as well as a kitchen scrapper bucket. But yeah, the green cone we're out. We should be getting more later in June. The Soil Saver, we have a good amount, but they're going quick. So make sure to come get it if you can. We're trying to partner with some towns to get them delivered. Like Castleton is selling them from their transfer station. So ask your town, or ask me if your town is selling it from their transfer station. And all that information is on our website for the details and the costs and such. So we can keep going ahead here. Worms. I had some worms in my apartment when I didn't have space to compost, but unfortunately they passed away, and I was really sad and I messed up. But I want to hear, Jacob, how do you succeed with your worms? What's your secret? Or Linda, actually, either of you.
Well, I'm still a worm novice. It's, you know, like if there was a tier of worm, like you become a black belt, I'm still like whatever the lower yellow or pink belt of vermicomposting. But I'm having a lot of fun. My worms eat a lot of my coffee grounds, or a lot of my fruits and vegetables that I chop up, and they were a great way to kind of supplement my backyard system, right? Worms, generally speaking, won't eat all of the food waste you're creating, but I know we've created some worm converts out of these workshops in the past. And I know Linda is very passionate about worms. Linda, did you want to say anything about worms right now?
No, I think you covered it well. They will die outside, so you have to keep them inside. You do have a special type of worm that's used for this. Let's see. Yeah, I think they're an awesome supplement for the winter. You have to kind of feed them minimally during the summer to keep them alive. But yeah, we'll go into it further maybe, or as people have questions. But
Nice, thank you.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess my disclaimer is that you do need to do some research to be able to do it effectively without harming any worms in the process. So we'll go on for now.
I will say though that once you get it set up, as long as you find something that works, as long as you keep doing that, they should live, Carl.
Yeah, definitely. I read a book since then, Worms Eat My Garbage by Mary Applehoff. I'd recommend that one. That's got me some confidence. And yeah, so what this is step one again, determining your goals. Do you want to save money because you don't want to pay for food scrap disposal? Or do you want to help preserve life on Earth by reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Do you want to grow food with your compost, or grow community with a garden and a compost system that serves your neighbors too? Do you want to go fishing, which actually you don't always use the same worms for fishing that you would for compost, but you could if you really wanted to. Or do you want to do all of the above? So those are just a few of the ideas. And as Jacob says, let's dig in to how to actually compost. So it's definitely, you know, at least in your backyard, you can compost any fruit scraps and vegetable scraps, along with coffee grounds and eggshells. And some people will compost bread and grains, and you know, whatever scraps you're generating that you can't always finish, or just the trimmings and such from the ends. And there are a lot of other ways to manage your scraps if you don't, if you want to prevent them from just being composted, like making soup stock, for instance. And we'll get creative with other ways later too, but I definitely challenge you to consider how you can prevent wasting your food before you end up having to compost it. So we'll go on to the next slide.
Jennifer had a good question earlier about like when you're cleaning out the sink and then you get all that, like the little bits, the little particles that swirl down to the drain, and then you gotta like reach in there and clean the food waste out of the drain. Can I compost that?
You sure could. It's going to be a pretty minimal amount. So even if you maybe poured milk down your drain, which hopefully you were able to drink your milk first, then it wouldn't make a huge difference on your compost pile. So I guess it depends on what you're pouring down your drain. But I will say that garbage disposals are not a recommended way of diverting food scraps from the trash, because they can often clog up your either septic system or your municipal system. So you want to make sure to check if your municipal system can handle it. I don't know many in Vermont that can, that are encouraging folks to put food scraps into the garbage disposal. And often, actually, that material will end up in the landfill anyways, unfortunately. So again, we're encouraging composting or drop off food scraps for diversion. And here's the recipe for compost. It needs kind of everything that we need to live. It's actually a little more easygoing than humans generally. So compost needs the green material, which you should probably be generating yourself with the food scraps. Starting with food scraps is fine. It needs the brown materials like leaves. That's
supposed to be straw.
Stew. I mean, what's wrong with stew in your No, that probably is supposed to be straw. I never
Vegetarians
caught
do.
that. Definitely leaves, straw, woody materials like wood chips, sawdust, and even some limited amounts of paper, shredded paper, especially brown paper, can work for that. And then it also needs a moisture content. Ideally, the squeeze test will show you it's not dripping wet, but it is moisture is appearing through your fingers when you squeeze it, as well as oxygen. And you don't have to turn it every day, every week. You don't even have to turn it if you want, if you're just gonna let it sit there and do its thing. But aerating it will allow it to break down quicker. And like I said earlier, it needs all the micro and macroorganisms that really do all the work for us. And that's kind of we're providing a good residence for them so that they can survive and thrive and get their fill on what they eat. And we'll continue here. So yeah, a little more about specifically what are greens, what are browns. We'll be sending resources out after this as well. And Linda has pulled together a lot of great resources on the details here. So yeah, we can go on for now. I mentioned a few of them. But what you don't want to put in your compost is meat, bones, dairy, any animal products, basically, because unless you're a really experienced composter, we're talking about cold composting that won't heat up, which is fine and it works, but the dairy and meat would start attracting animals, which you probably wouldn't want, and possibly just create poor odors that you also probably don't want. Weed seeds will persist through cold composting and end up in your garden if you're using that, as well as diseases and pathogens from plants and feces. So there was a question about using animal feces. So no, you don't want to put feces in your backyard compost bin. Some people will designate a green cone just for their animal feces, which is interesting, as long as you're not putting the litter in there, because that inhibits the bacterial growth that helps break it down and neutralize it eventually. If you are using any paper, you don't want magazines or any glossy and extra colorful paper. And definitely don't want any herbicides, fungicides, pesticides. All that means kill, kill, kill. So try and avoid killing your compost, right? And the cut flowers specifically have fungicides on them. And we want fungus because that's another key player in our compost. So once you get a bucket or whatever works for you, you can, again, rinse it out after you dump it out. And chopping up the food scraps will help them break down a lot quicker, which is great. And if you need to put it in the fridge, freezer, keep it a low odor. The other things you don't want to put in there are plastics, metals, things that aren't coming from living organisms. So,
Carl, Jennifer, who asked the question about cat poop,
yeah,
is clarifying it in the chat. What if she just used the cat poop for plants, but not something she was going to eat again? Does anybody, is that the same? Are you still recommending that she separate her animal waste from her food waste?
I'd like to hear Linda's perspective, because Linda has gone into the details as a master composter on that.
I would still not feel comfortable doing it, because if there are any pathogens in there that if your cat has any health issues that you're not aware of, this type of composting will not kill that. I realize you're trying to keep it away from your food, but let's see, you're talking about food and paper.
Clarification too, that it's separate from food waste composting, which makes sense.
Right. If you kept it far away from, the rest of your soil, I mean, where you're, if you kept it in a far part of your yard, sure, give it a try. But I wouldn't keep it near, I wouldn't even put it in the flower bed, because you're going to be working in the soil. And I don't know, I wouldn't do it. But maybe you can find a compostable litter.
Yeah, I think in our culture in the United States that I've experienced, where we have quite an aversion to feces and even talking about it. So we might want to research other places that have been doing that for a while. And, you know, some places will even use human manure to
True.
fertilize fields after a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
So definitely something to consider.
They're
Yeah,
doing that down in Brattleboro. They're using, there's a urine collection program, and they're using it to fertilize fields. And I'm also designing a composting toilet. So that's something to talk about later.
Yeah, urine can be used as a compost starter, because it does, but in minor, small quantities. And again, you know, if you just want to feel safe, don't put any of those things in. I don't, is it totally bad? I don't know. Should it be researched? Probably. Maybe she'd like to do some research. Jennifer would like to do some research on that and get back to us.
So there's a couple other great questions I think we should address now. And I've been watching the chat for those questions that are buried now. We're going to get back to those. Same question about dog poop versus not putting it in the landfill. I think it's always safe to say you could always create a separate pile and cover it, or bury it, right?
Yeah.
Or use a green cone, which will break it down. Another question we might want to address about 3 bins. Why use 3 bins? And Abigail said in the chat, you use 3 bins to transfer it. So sometimes some folks, like Linda, I believe, you'll have a compost pile that's still kind of working and a compost pile that's closer to finishing. And the 3 bins kind of help separate a compost pile that's just starting, and then when you turn it, you move it to the next bin, and it will sit longer and break down more. Any other questions that I'm missing about food stuff in general? There's a question about paper towels, paper napkins, tissues.
They're all good.
Browns.
They're fine.
They're fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
And more good chat about urine in the chat if folks are interested. But otherwise, I think we can keep going. Should I go to the next slide, Carl?
Yes, please.
We're almost
good,
done.
Good questions, everyone. Yeah, again, the main thing you want to make sure.
Brown for the paper towels. So Jennifer asked if paper towels are green or brown. I'm sorry, but
oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're brown.
Definitely brown. They're based in paper and trees. So as well as leaves come from trees, and they're definitely brown. You want to add at least, so if you're adding a bucket of food scraps, you fill your bucket up, dump it 3 times with brown stuff, because you can never have too many browns, and they're going to prevent any possible issues you could imagine, from rodents, bears, and odors and angry neighbors and all that. So just keep adding browns. That's the main thing. And if you can shred them up, that's great. Otherwise, you can still add like larger wood chips, and that will still help aerating it. But leaves tend to be the most readily available, easy to break down once they're shredded up. Otherwise, they might kind of mat together. So definitely recommend whacking them or mowing them somehow. Yeah, let's keep going here. And then the aeration. So again, you can turn it every week if you want, or every day if you really love your compost, and sing to it and give it hugs and tell it it's pretty and wonderful. And it will probably start working really well. Not that it wouldn't if you don't do those things, but it never hurts to give it some positive energy and love too. So yeah, it just kind of depends on what you're trying to get out of it and how quickly you want it to work. So yeah, let's keep going. And then you just let it sit there for a while. And once it could take up to a year or more, especially through the cold months. It's not going to break down necessarily. So if you have adequate browns in there when everything thaws, then it won't start to smell again because you've been adding food scraps all winter. And so how would you use it? You can use it on your lawn for fertilizer, in your garden beds as an amendment, on kind of top dressing to add nutrients later, and even in your house plants. And if you really don't want to, can't use it, don't think you have a use for it, post on Front Porch Forum. And I've seen people do that, and they'll get it picked up really quickly, like within a few days, if because people are always looking for compost, that's for sure. And we'll continue. So a little more about bears. Ideally, we prevent bears from coming around property to start. So if you're just throwing food into the woods, that might attract them. And having it in a bin will, with plenty of browns, will help prevent that from attracting them in the first place, as well as bird feeders. Now they're saying in Vermont to take down bird feeders from March, even as soon as early March to November, and not putting them up until December through March, or through February, that is. And yeah, if you're really worried about it, you can drop it off at the transfer station.
We had another pest questions about rats. And
Yep.
do rats ever become a problem around composting? Do you give the same recommendation? Are bears and rats one in this? I mean, is the troubleshooting the same, or are there other techniques to reduce the potential of rat behavior?
Yeah, so rats and mice can get through half-inch gaps. So if you have quarter-inch hardware cloth, either lining the bin or on the bottom, at least if it's a store-bought bin, then you should be good in preventing any of those from getting in. But they won't be able to knock over the bin, whereas bears might. So you know, none of the bins are necessarily bear proof. So if you need to dig a pit or a ditch to bury it, you know, things could dig it up, but that would still help it break down quicker, and they wouldn't end up knocking over your bin that you just bought. So no, they're definitely not the same. You have to approach it differently. The main thing is for the rodents, you need to have quarter-inch or smaller spaces that they can't chew through.
All right.
But
Also, be cautious of the browns. Use a lot of browns because it's the odor of the food that's attracting all of the pests. So if you're covering your food scraps with browns, it won't let the odor out. They won't know there's food there, and you shouldn't have. I haven't had an issue unless I've been lazy and haven't covered my food. So
it's certainly something to think about when you're designing your system. Do you live in bear country or rat country? I don't know if that's but you know, and planning ahead of time, you know, if I'm using a soil saver, should I layer quarter-inch hardware cloth at the bottom? We're almost at the end here, and we're going to dig into some questions. Any last words on the presentation? Otherwise, I'll stop screen sharing, Carl.
No, I think we're good to go with questions.
Dun-da-da. Cool. Okay, I'm super excited because this is a question asking group last time, and I'm not bad mouthing the last group. They were a little shy, but this group certainly isn't shy. So going way back in the chat, we had a question about that Casella.
Someone asked about the bleached Kleenex.
Yeah,
the small quantity that you're going to use is not a problem. if you're gonna, be putting boxes and boxes of Kleenex in there, I don't know, maybe, but the normal quantity would not be a problem. The other guideline on paper is try to use leaves or some other form of brown, because if you can recycle, if it's recyclable paper, rule of thumb, at least the way they taught it to us, was if you can recycle it, otherwise compost it. So paper towels, napkins, Kleenex that you can't recycle, good choices.
What do you use
Anyway,
for
that's
browns,
it on
Linda?
bleach products.
What do you use for browns at your house?
Yeah, for now.
Oh, okay. So earlier in the chat, we had a question about that. Casella's not picking up food waste yet. Carl, do we have an update on when Casella will, or other options for folks who can't get to a local transportation or don't have access to transportation to get up to Gleason Road? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Technically, no one's required to pick up food scraps for individual households, though there are a few companies that might. And if you're interested, definitely contact me. I can help figure out what area you're in and if there is any food scrap hauler servicing that area for individuals. But yeah, as for transporting it, you might end up being better off trying to take on worm composting if you can. And yeah, just making sure that that is a really good question, and it is unfortunate that we are limited in that sense with our infrastructure and being able to serve everyone that deserves to have food scrap collection. Eventually, I think we will improve that and it will become more readily available. But yeah, for now, the best option I can suggest is the worm composting, or talking to your neighbors, seeing if they don't mind if you share in their compost systems.
So I can add a little bit to that too. If you live in an apartment complex with more than 4 units, the haulers are required to pick up your food scraps. But that's only if you're in an apartment complex. And it doesn't even actually, I just found out it doesn't apply to condominiums. So if you're in a condominium development, they don't fall under the law.
Well, I wouldn't hesitate to check with your neighbors, because I've been begging my neighbors for their food scraps, because I've just got so many systems going that I don't have enough food scraps. So it may sound silly to you at first, but don't hesitate.
So another question is, how often should we turn the pile? I turn my pile maybe once a year. Since doing these workshops, I've turned my pile more frequently because it's like a bit of like a facilitator guilt complex going on. But Linda, how often do you turn a pile?
Oh, I'm probably, let's see, I do it in the spring. Well, you have to keep in mind I have a winter system, and then I have the one here at the lake that I start up in the spring again. But I often will turn that just to get it started, because, and then I will turn it to get it started, and then maybe once during the summer, and that's probably about it. I don't turn it that often. It speeds up if you do it more often, but if you want to be lazy, that's fine. It works too.
How long does it take you to get compost?
I have some by the next season, so I'm running it from spring to fall, and then by the beginning of the next spring I could take some off the bottom of the, I have one that where I harvest from the bottom, and that's ready. I actually put some leaves in one of the soil savers, filled that up over the winter, and I had pretty close to finished leaf mold by this spring. So yeah, I figure about a batch a year.
Jennifer has another good question. Her compost isn't breaking down very fast. Can she add more browns later in the process, What helps compost move along faster? Adding more browns or aerating or both?
All of the above, yeah. Yeah, aerating, browns. If there's too much food, if that's the reason it's not decomposing, add the browns. You can always add browns and mix them in. It'll be happy that you did.
Cool. M. Brown is wondering, are individual towns collecting food scraps that are a part of Rutland Solid Waste District? Carl, maybe you could speak to that. Individual towns aren't hauling and collecting yet, correct? Just collecting at transfer stations?
That's correct.
Yeah, maybe one day.
Maybe.
There is a call out for extra worms. I may have some later this summer, so do stay in touch. If you post on Facebook or a Front Porch Forum, you certainly may get some extra worms. A lot of worms, red wiggler worms, the species we're talking about, come from down south. And you can buy some online as well, even though it can be like a little spendy to start.
Right.
But I'm sure there are some extra worms around if you put the call out there.
I noticed Nordmeyer is also attending, and she's been worm composting for lots of years. I don't know if she's a source of worms. I might be as well. And the Gardener's Supply is the pricey place. It's about $37, I assume, plus shipping and so forth. But that is a source.
And you usually want to start out with a good mass, right? Like a pound.
Yeah,
possible.
about 1,000, they say. I think that's about a pound of worms. If you're buying from a supplier or a fellow composter, they'll know how much to give you to start with. But starting with a half dozen of them is not going to do any good. It's got to be, yeah, a big glob of them.
There's a good question on hot composting versus cold composting. Maybe you could just give us a quick breakdown. Is it possible to do hot composting in Vermont, or is that at a scale beyond most folks?
It's usually difficult to get enough mass, volume, but it's not impossible. It can be done. You just have to be attentive. You have to buy equipment to get the thermometer and be checking that, and it's just a more expensive and labor intensive process, but it can be done.
And you need a certain mass just to cold compost too, right? Doesn't the pile need to be a certain?
Well, they recommend 3 feet by 3 feet, 3 feet square and then 3 feet high to really get it going, but it still works. I mean, if anybody, you've all undoubtedly left some leaves or weeds or something at the side of your yard and they'll break down. So this is essentially the same process where we're just not highly managing it. We're just managing it enough to break it down. But it's helpful to have a larger volume. That's why the purchased bins are always that size that they are, and why you use pallets to make a homemade bin or set of bins, because they're the right size to give you the volume. Plus it's a workable size too. I mean, if you're going to turn your pile, it gives you room to move.
Sure. There's a question on Front Porch Forum. We've mentioned it a couple times. It's kind of like a digital bulletin board. So if you just go to Front Porch Forum, you can sign up for your area, and then you get email blasts, and there's a lot on there like, hey, I'm selling a lawnmower. Hey, I have extra worms for composting. It might get posted on there in the next week. Pam's wondering about other manures that can be added to the compost pile. What about horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure? How do we think about other manure and their relationship to food scraps?
All of those manures are great. They're great choices. Typically what you want to avoid are the animals that eat meat, like dogs, cats, pigs. But any grain eating or food scrap eating, chicken manure, those are all super things to add to your compost.
Do you cut your compost with anything, Linda, before you amend your garden or beds with it? Do you mix it with dirt or any other things, or worm castings, or?
the outdoor compost I just mix in, or just will put it on the surface and use it almost like a mulch. But the worms, it's a stronger product, a more intense product. So I do mix that in with potting soil. I tend to use that on, well, that's not even true. Yeah, I mix that in much more so before I add the plants to it. I don't like put a pile of that in a planting hole and then stick a plant on top of it. I would mix it in before I did that.
Does
The
anybody-
compost, oh, go ahead. Somebody was going to ask a question or answer.
Oh, no, you do continue.
Okay, I apologize for, I've got the setting sun in my face here, so if I'm
It's very nice
right,
light.
that's why.
I wish I was on Lake Dunmore right now. The reason why I have a virtual background is because I'm not on Lake Dunmore.
Oh, I like your background. It's good. So how are we doing with questions? Yeah, that's good. Abigail just say manures are green. Yeah, so if you have actually if you have horse manure, it can get so much bedding in it that it turns into a brown because it's, the proportions shift, but it's all good. And mostly they're greens. And I see someone raising a hand.
Where is the hand raising? I don't see the hand raising.
JMHAL. There he is.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Speak.
yeah. I have a question that may apply to others. I have a green cone in my yard that I put out, 4 or 5 years ago, but it seems kind of full right now. So I'm not using it anymore. I bring all my food scraps to the transfer station. But what do you do when your green cone is overfilled?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
yeah. Do you have one, Carl? I don't yet. Nancy, I know, has one.
no, I don't have a green cone, but I've had a lot of experience with folks that do. And I know someone who's left it in the same spot for 10 years and it's never filled up. So really paying attention to where you place it is key to start. If it does fill up, that's probably likely due to the placement. So you either need to try and relocate it possibly to another place with very much, like as much sun exposure as possible. Full sun is ideal. And drainage, so if you dump a 5-gallon bucket of water, it should drain through in a minute or less.
Okay.
And there
Well,
are,
I think it's well located. It gets lots of sun. I think the drainage is good, and I put some stones in the bottom of it. But over time, and I'm talking like 5 years, it's not full, but it seems
like
pretty
it's not
full.
going down as much.
It's not going down as much as I would like it to.
Yeah,
and I
they
have a
also
garden
have,
around it that does well.
cool. Yeah, so
I'm sorry, go ahead, Carl. My apologies.
they also have accelerator powder. You could even just use like a compost starter powder, or throwing in some soil, some compost to help provide the microbes that will allow it to break down, or maybe worms. Could be good.
So
Wouldn't they get killed? I don't know.
Well,
I have heard, Jim, that you
yeah.
should move them the cones every 2 to 3 years to prevent buildup like you're experiencing.
Right. That's
I
a
guess.
real pain.
Yeah, I know. You 2 feet down, and yeah. So you might want to consider putting your vegetable and fruit food scraps into some other system, and just use your cone for the meats and things that aren't recommended for home composting.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Since I'm facilitating, I'm jumping all the questions in the chat. Accelerator powder. Can we pause on accelerator powder and talk about that? Is that starter culture basically? And
Yeah.
tagging on with Jennifer's questions, like, do we need starter culture? Are there other things that we can use as starter culture if we don't have a compost pile?
Yeah, it's both starter, like microbes as well as nutrients that the microbes can use. So it might have calcium and other random minerals and stuff. You don't, yeah, I guess the alternative is compost itself, which has a great balance of those things as well. And yeah, can work just as well as far as I know.
For Jennifer's question, she's seems to be talking about an outdoor bin, am I correct? And as long as it's on the soil, on the ground, okay, she says outdoor, you should be getting natural microbes and worms and critters coming up from underneath. It's just if you're on a, not on soil, that's your problem. Oh, rotating bins. Oh, Mary, your lower left corner, unmute yourself. Or maybe Mary A, yeah, lower left corner, can you find it?
In the past, we had also talked about yogurt.
Yes, you can put some yogurt in, that's got some starters,
Does
bacteria.
bacteria come from the soil, or is it also airborne? Or is it both? Is it both?
Just a
I'm
hint,
sorry.
the facilitator can unmute Mary. So Carl, if you unmute Mary, if she can't find her way to it.
I'm looking through the chat for Mary.
No, she was just kind of waiting to get our attention and speaking. Oh, she was just saying goodbye, maybe, that was all.
I don't see her in the chat anymore.
No.
Well, really quick on the tumblers that Jennifer was asking, once you've had it in there for a while, you definitely want to empty it out onto the soil so that it can finish breaking down.
Right, that's her problem, yeah.
What about citrus? Is there ways to make citrus break down faster? Does chopping it up into smaller bits help?
That would help, yes.
And do worms like citrus?
In moderation, I put the skins in. I wouldn't put the actual fruit portion into the worms, and I wouldn't do a lot of it. But I eat a lot of those little clementines in the winter between my husband and myself, so they enjoy those, the peels on those.
I enjoy
those.
those.
Fine.
Yeah. I enjoy the peels.
Right, not the I eat the fruit.
These are great questions. In the past, folks have been curious about wood ashes. Do wood ashes count as browns?
Ah, okay. I sort of misspoke on that the first time that was asked, so I will get it right this time. Wood ashes are alkaline. And in a small quantity, if you have a lot of acidic, like if you're using a lot of, say, oak leaves, which are acidic, or you have a lot of fruit peels, and you don't want to grow azaleas or other acid-loving plants, you can add some wood ash to it to change the pH. But you don't want to use a lot of it because most plants prefer to be on the slightly, you don't want a highly alkaline compost. So I don't know if that was too technical or not technical enough, but
so maybe a separate pile for your wood ash. So you have a pet waste pile, a wood ash pile, and
yeah, and you can add some if you feel the need. You know, if you'd almost want to test your soil or your compost to do that. But yeah, separate pile.
Chris is wondering
Side of the yard.
broccoli. Can you give broccoli to worms, or can you not? Have you heard about that?
I've given broccoli to worms. It smells like broccoli for the first day. If you don't mind that, the worms are happy. If you don't like walking by your bin and smelling broccoli, since mine's in the kitchen, but if it's in the garage or in the basement or somewhere else, broccoli's terrific, no problem.
And I also presume broccolini, perhaps.
Yes, and cauliflower and any of the other members of
Brassicas.
that family.
What about other things like cooking oils? What do I do with say like I'm frying up some shrimp tonight. What do I do with the leftover cooking oil?
Put it in the trash.
I try to reuse it. But
Okay.
if you have a lot, if you have a lot of grease or something, yeah, you don't want to put it in your compost or even the drop off at the transfer station. You can put limited amounts, and definitely not down the drain. So
Right.
Could I
yeah,
pour it on the grass somewhere outside? Is that fine?
What? Go ahead, Carl. What are you thinking?
I guess it depends if you're going to walk on it later.
The oil does not break down quickly. It will, depending upon what you cooked in it, it might attract animals. So I suppose it's okay to throw out food things that are not, if you home compost, you can throw out foods that are not appropriate for home composting. And I think this one might count. If you had a big thing, a big jar of it, and you can't reuse it. On the grass. What do you do with yours, Carl? Do you put it on the, Jacob, do you put it on the grass?
Well, I'm not trying to confuse folks. I know Jennifer said she's confused, but I am trying to like find the weird little gray areas about how we all handle our food. Typically, I reuse my oil. So I'll leave it on the stove in a pot and I'll fry with it until it turns, if you fry too much, anybody who's sat behind a fryer in a restaurant would know eventually the oil spoils. It gets too smoky to work with. And then I do, I go over to like a wood line and I put it near the border between my lawn and the woods. But I have a spot where I can do that. Not everybody has a spot where they can dispose of oil. So that's why I was trying to throw some fastballs at y'all.
Yeah, and I'll clarify that you wouldn't, thank you, Krista, you wouldn't want to throw liquid oil, like a bunch of it, in your garbage because it will make it really messy for the trash hauler. We have
put it in a container first, which I neglected to say.
Which it could still break even.
True.
So, for instance, Bill has said that you can go to a restaurant and ask if they'll take it for a grease collection. Because, a lot of restaurants with fry oil have that grease trap out back.
And then that goes to run buses in Burlington, right?
So can I speak on that you can't put any food waste in the trash?
Sure.
As Carl said earlier, no one is going to be policing your trash. And the Agency of Natural Resources realized that some of these food waste are just not going to make it into the compost. So if you have fried chicken, as Jacob said, and small amounts of it are okay in your compost, but if you have a large quantity of it and you really can't do anything with it, try taking something like a milk jug, and putting it in there and sealing the top and putting it in your trash. Carl, absolutely right. The haulers do not want grease and oil when they pick up the trash bags, but try to think of it as small quantities. The other thing is you can hold on to some of this stuff and put it into your compost in small quantities. So, you can keep it in your freezer or keep it in your refrigerator and just put it out in small quantities if you're concerned about putting it in the trash.
Do we know if haulers are going to be possibly fined at landfills for having excessive amounts of food waste in the trash, the way that they can be for recycling?
That is a possibility.
Because if that is the case, then, individuals aren't being policed for recycling either, but haulers are, and those violations are then reflected in people's trash bills later on.
So the agency is really trying not to go for the violation route. They're really trying for the education route. And they realize that this is just not going to happen on July 1st. There's going to be some issues, there's going to be some problems, and there is going to be a learning curve. Learning curve for haulers, learning curve for residents. And the haulers, I think at this point, especially with the COVID-19, they are trying to figure out how to stay in business. And I think as time goes by, if they feel that this is something lucrative, that they will open up hauling options to residents. I know some of them are looking at trying to figure out how to collect the compost and the recycling and the trash in the same truck so that they can do kind of one-stop shopping. There's been discussion about them collecting the food waste in compostable bags and then taking it back to the tipping floor and then sorting it, which doesn't seem like a really perfect idea. But they are discussing it. So I think as time goes by, watch for updates on what is happening in your area.
Great questions. Trish, you have a hand raised. Did you have a question? You could unmute yourself or.
Yes. So as we are talking about how to save the world through composting, I have to wonder that when we have garbage pits and depots and all of this that do not have these wastes, what is breaking them down once they're sealed? So if we're not adding food waste and we're not adding the papers and the other things that create the composts, what is ultimately breaking down what does make it into these heaps over the lifetime of the planet, so to speak?
So, and maybe there's other folks who can speak to this more, and this is also getting to your question again, Jennifer. Bacteria still lives in the landfill, and it creates an anaerobic bacteria that can live without oxygen. And they produce, when the bacteria starts eating and breaking down all the little bits of nitrogen and carbon, it starts producing carbon dioxide and methane. And that's what's drifting up through the landfill. And usually landfills have a way of capturing those gases, but the systems aren't perfect. They lose a lot of gases. It also costs a lot of money too, which is kind of what we're hinting at about the systems in Vermont, right? Like, it costs the taxpayers a lot of money if 1/3 of all of our black Glad trash bags are full with food. Does that make any sense? Did I answer that?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely say that, you know, ideally we won't have landfills at some point. Of course, there are many products that we don't have systems for dealing with currently in recycling or repurposing. But the fact is that plastic, if we have to put it in a landfill, since it's not, certain things aren't recyclable, it will get compacted regardless, just from the machinery that drives over it. It doesn't necessarily need to be broken down by a biological process to accomplish that. So I would say the more we can get out of the trash, the better. But having it in there isn't going to necessarily prevent landfills from fulfilling their kind of their role. So I thank you, Krista, for pointing out a nice book, Garbology. Definitely will break that down into detail on what's going on in the landfill.
And it'll, if we reduce the amount that goes in the landfill, right, it sets back the amount of time before we need to like expand the landfill again, which costs many, many millions of dollars, right? Because landfill space is very limited and nobody wants a landfill in their backyard. That's why the project in Coventry was so controversial. I feel like we just had another question, but I don't know where it went. Are there any other questions? Does anybody have any questions about landfill or regulations or other things that should or should not go in the compost? I agree, you know, generally speaking, the less the less we can put in ourselves, the better, as a general rule. But nobody's going to be slapping your wrist on this one. I remember, Carl, you showed me the data on recycling, and you can kind of watch over the years how much recyclable bottles have decreased in the trash. Does that trend still continue? Are people still recycling more and more?
As far as I know, yeah. I don't actually remember what you're referring to.
I think it was when, because every couple years there's an audit or something of the recyclables. Do you want to tell folks about that?
That was the first pie chart you showed. And so that was 2018, the most recent waste composition study of Vermont landfill and what's going in the trash. So there's going to be another one in 2023. So every 5 years, actually. So we'll see then, you know, this pandemic has definitely impacted that. There was a couple questions I might try and address, if that covers that for now, from the poll or the registration for folks that might not be here. Question about compostable bags. You really need to check with for dropping off food scraps in compostable bags, that is. You really need to check with the transfer station or hauler. Generally, no one around in our county wants compostable bags in the drop-off compost. So I would encourage you just to stick with the paper bag because it will break down and it will contain the food scraps well enough. And if you have to wrap it in a plastic bag and then dump it out with the paper bag, then you can rinse off your plastic bag and recycle that at a drop-off retail store, for instance. There was another question.
Greg, I don't know if I can show that pie chart without subjecting everybody to going through the whole PowerPoint presentation again. But I'll leave my email and I will email it to you afterwards, okay? Or if you leave your email, I can also email you. Send it to me in the chat, I guess. I'll send you mine.
Oh, something real quick on bears. Again, I didn't address bear proofing anything. Like the containers themselves might not be bear proof, but some people have put up electric fences to try and deter bears. Again, you can't really bear proof it, but that will definitely help prevent them from wanting to come by if they get shocked.
Yeah.
So that's
the state is recommending suspending a rag soaked in ammonia by your bin or even within your bin, and re-soaking it every 2 to 3 weeks. I haven't tried that, but the idea is to confuse their senses and actually provide something unpleasant. So before you invest in the electric fence or a barking dog, you might try that.
The other thing is the composters that are off the ground, like the tumbling composters.
Right.
Those are a little bit better than the ones that are on the ground if you think you have a bear problem.
Yeah, if you start it in one of those tumblers, that's a great point, Pam. And then once it's been in there for a while, it'll stop resembling and smelling like food, and then you move that into a compost bin. That should get you past the point where the critters are interested in what you've got there. I don't really know many people who've had good luck getting finished compost out of the tumblers, but they certainly have their place. We talked about them for inside in winter. That's a great way to just store it. But anything up off the ground like that, what else is there? Green cone, that's in the ground. The tumblers are off the ground. Although why don't the bears go for that, Pam?
I don't know. That's what the agency is recommending. The other thing is if you have a composter, as Carl said, if you use like the tack cloth, you can dig down and, dig down and like bury the tack cloth so that it goes up in it so that when they go to dig, they can't really dig into it as well. Although I've heard that bears can actually pick up the composters and walk off with them. So I think it's an individual case of how bad is your situation, and what you need to do with it.
Right. Yeah. If you take the feeders down, if you make sure you're covering it with browns, if you do everything you can to discourage the bears, hopefully you won't get to that point, because they can be very creative and destructive. But I have not heard, we have one area here on Lake Dunmore where people keep their bird feeders up all the time, and their compost bins are not well thought out and all, and they're a problem. But our road here is not an issue. So I think we're doing things right.
Because you keep the neighborhood in line, Linda, I'm sure, the composting neighborhood. Andrew had a good question about composting in the winter and adding browns. Do you add browns in the wintertime? How do you store your browns? I'm going to confess, as a lazy composter, Andrew, I do not add a whole huge amount of browns during the wintertime. And is it true that no composting really happens in the wintertime? Is composting basically just on pause as it freezes? Can you speak to that, Linda?
Sure. Yes, it is on pause while it's frozen. But that's terrific, because while it's frozen, the cell walls of the food are breaking down, and when it thaws in the spring, it's even more ready to go. So mix in your browns in the spring, and you'll be fine. It'll start working faster actually than if it were fresh. Make sure that you cover the food in the winter with the browns. Again, just because you want to keep. That's when your mice and I don't know about rats particularly, I'm not as familiar with their food and habitat preferences, but the mice will seek out a warm spot, and so it's good to not be attracting them with anything with the food. So again, browns. As Carl said, I think browns are the answer to everything. Add more browns.
This is great. Are there any other straggling questions? Maybe questions I missed in the chat? Any other problems, curious things, regulatory questions folks have? Otherwise, we're going to move towards closing. If I know everybody's eligible for a discount, if you are interested in a soil saver or a green cone.
Sorry, that's not true anymore.
Oh. Oh, never mind. Forget what I said.
That was while supplies lasted, and they have flown out the door.
Not eligible for a discount anymore while supplies lasted. Supplies did not last. But everybody is eligible to get a recording of this presentation or a copy of the presentation PowerPoint. Do you recommend any brand of compost accelerator? I think that one's directed at Carl or Linda, maybe Pam.
I don't have one off the top of my head.
You what?
No, I don't have one off the top of my head. The green cone just usually comes with the powder. That is.
To get it started?
Yeah.
Okay. And beyond that, you don't really need it with, a bin or an outdoor pile, because as long as it's in contact with the ground, you'll get all of the natural critters coming in there, so you don't need to add them. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Jacob, do I have time to do a food cycler piece?
Yeah, we'd love to hear about the food cycler. I mean,
okay.
I would love to hear about it.
There is another option if you can't easily compost. I use the food cycler. You can go on and look at it, nofoodwaste.com. It looks like a bread machine, and you put all of your food scraps in it, with the exception of beef and lamb and pork bones, but it will even do chicken bones. And you turn it on, and it grinds and dries all of your food scraps in 3 hours. And then I feed mine to my chickens. But you can put citrus, you can put anything in it. It is a little on the pricey side. It's about $300, but I've had mine for this particular one I've had for 2 years, and it takes all of the food scraps for a family of 5 and a son that does a catering business. So I would highly recommend it if a compost pile is not something that you think that you can attempt. So anyway, that's a different option.
Pam showed us a video of this rig. It's pretty cool. It makes like powdered compost pretty quickly. So it takes your chicken bones and it dries them and pulverizes them?
It actually, I didn't believe it when I got it. My son told me about it. He did a catering event and someone there had one. So I found it, I ordered it, and I thought, it's not gonna work. So I put in an entire chicken carcass to see what it would do. And at the end of 3 hours, I had bone meal. Not one shred, not one anything. It works great on things like that. Some things like citrus peels, you end up with like a very small citrus peel. And I take mine and I do put it in the garden. It's what needs it more, the garden or the chickens. And some of the stuff you can kind of see it sort of when it gets wet, it'll start looking like it's going to, come alive again. It just breaks down and goes into the soil. So you can kind of set it aside in a bucket for a month and let it dry out more, then add it to your garden. But it's a good option, especially for somebody who maybe can't get to the transfer station, can't do compost.
And it's under high heat or pressure? How does it break it down so fast?
It looks just like a bread machine. In the bottom, there are grinders. There's a little rotating grinder that grinds it up and it dries it. And it's a workhorse. I mean, I tell you, I see the question here. So how much does it hold? I would say probably 4 to 5 cups of food waste. How much do you get back? About a cup. And we use it every single day. Everything we have that goes through here goes either to the chickens or to the food cycler. Does it get hot? It gets hot like a bread machine. That's the best thing, and it takes up the space of a bread machine.
Do you think the chickens know that they're getting?
So this is what I'm going to tell you. They eat anything, and if you want to have a fun time on Saturday night, feed your chickens ziti. Because it's hysterical. But so if I put citrus peels in with the chickens, they won't eat it. But if I put it through the food cycler and put it in with the chickens, it's like they're getting candy. They go nuts over it. So it's just a really good viable option for some. Yeah, I do have happy chickens. They fed us family of 5 eggs through the whole pandemic.
Nice. Yeah, chickens are incredible. What if we just want to feed our food scraps to chickens, Linda? Are there like do's and don'ts? What do chickens like?
I don't have chickens. My sister does. Pam does. There's probably someone else who can answer that better.
They eat pretty much anything. So they'll eat anything, including their distant relatives. Yeah.
Cool.
And honestly, your eggs are better. You can tell the difference if you take a look at like my eggs. The yolk on them is almost orange. If you take a store-bought egg, even the expensive store-bought eggs, and you crack it right next to it, it's not orange, and the yolk and the white almost sort of separates. Whereas on these eggs, the white stays solid, just like when you crack it open.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. A well-fed chicken, you get much better eggs. I watched that crazy Chef's Table. This is a large digression. That show Chef's Table on Netflix. And at Stone Barns, there's this guy who just feeds peppers to chickens. And because the chickens can't taste the capsaicin, the molecule that makes peppers spicy, then they started making these eggs that just had like red yolks.
Yeah, that's different.
You feed them, I'll feed you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Otherwise, I can talk about Netflix for the rest of the night, but I don't think you want to hear about that.
Yeah, okay, someone asked about the dried food from what Pam's been talking about. And it's not technically compost, but as soon as you put it in the garden, all the it'll spring to life, and all of the microbes and so forth would work on it. And so yes, you can put it in the garden, but you don't technically have compost yet.
Right.
And I guess it's possible that it could attract rodents since the chickens like it.
Yeah, I've never had that problem. Well, for one thing, I spread it out, so it would be quite a lot for them to try to come and find this and eat it. But so far, I haven't had any problem with that. And I would know because I can deal with snakes, spiders, everything, mice, I'm out of there.
We all have our own things, right? So did we get everybody? I'm not sure that there was one question about what the food scraps that we can't throw out, and I'm skimming through chat here, and it seems like
Yeah, I think Jennifer had some questions on that when we were fleshing out, and we had a longer discussion about, you know, it's about just kind of doing the best that you can, putting the least amount in the trash bag as possible. Is that what you were thinking about?
yeah, I think that's what she was getting at, that one, and whether we covered that well enough for her. I mean, really, there's quite a bit that can go into the compost, and you could certainly get those food scraps out of your sink and put them in, and it's not just rotten food. I mean, anything as you're peeling, cutting off leaves, you know, any food preparation that's left over that you don't use for some other purpose can go in your compost. Anything, you know, your yard, your gardening weeds without seeds and things of that nature. So the food scraps still make up the bulk of what I end up putting in my compost. Maybe Jennifer's got a really efficient household. I don't know. But did we answer that for you, Jennifer? I'm not sure if we did. I guess has she gone?
She's been chatting.
She just
Okay.
responded in the chat again about being clear with communication when explaining it to the public. And I totally agree. I think there's a lot of misinformation about the composting law coming out there, or maybe not misinformation, but unclear information. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this workshop. Plus it's fun, and we're all kind of big compost geeks. Yeah, you can certainly talk out, Louse. Forgot to be there.
Can I speak out loud?
Oh yeah, do join the conversation.
You guys are awesome. This is so great. You're answering so many questions I have. And I grew up in a household where we were composting and recycling since like the 60s and 70s, but you've refined my way of doing it so many ways. So I thank all of you. My only frustration has been that I know a lot of people don't do any of these things because they just get overwhelmed with how to do it. And there's so many ways to set it up in your home easily. And what has frustrated me with the instructions I'm seeing that we get in Wallingford from our town hall, from the clerk, and what I find online from Rutland, are they're totally conflicting about the food waste issue in the trash. So I would just say, since you guys seem plugged into whoever's putting out the information, I think you'll get better compliance if it's really simple and it's not conflicting. And I'm happy to talk to whoever's doing it to share the stuff I'm seeing. But you guys have been fantastic. So I'm really excited. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So many great questions from your end tonight. And we were originally scheduled to do a whole workshop in Wallingford, and it was going to be wonderful. But COVID put a foot down on it. But maybe in the future we could do one in Wallingford. What do you think about that, Carl?
Definitely.
Whenever that future is, but yeah. Anybody else? Post-COVID road trip.
Chris, if you share your email in the chat before we close, then I'll get the 350 link to you. We're meeting on Sunday. Yeah. Maybe we can all just unmute and say good night, have a great night, and then we'll close out.
Good night, you guys. That was awesome.
Good night.
Thank you.
Right.
Great participants.
Thank you, guys. You did a great job again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, good question.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.